Buenas tardes, buenas noches. My name is Omar Dawahare, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. On behalf of our director, Jill Lane, our faculty and students, I want to welcome you and our distinguished guests, Larissa Garzon and Perla Guerrero, into our virtual space in what promises to be an insightful conversation on food production and Latinx community building in the US South in the context of COVID-19. I want to thank our co-presenters, the Latinx Project at NYU, led by Professor Arlene Davila and represented by our co-organizer and moderator, Professor Mireya Loza, as well as our co-sponsors, the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU Steinhardt, chaired by Krishna Nurrey, and the North American Congress on Latin America, whose executive editor is Professor Alejandro Velasco, with a special mention to David Pastor, who is both at NACLA and the Latinx Project, and he's been a collaborator in putting this event together. Our mission as a Title VI National Research Center and academic program of promoting an understanding of our Latin American and Caribbean region continues in times of COVID-19 and social distancing, as well as our commitment of exploring the experience of our communities in the US who are so critical to our foodways and disproportionately affected by the pandemic. This mission and your work and interest is what brings us together in conversation today. So thanks again for being here. And now please welcome Mireya Loza, who's Assistant Professor at the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU Steinhardt, who will formally introduce our guests, Larissa and Perla. Gracias.
Thank you, Omar. So this event is brought to you by a collaboration between the Latinx Project and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. I welcome you to follow the Latinx Project in class on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, so that you can receive updates on the next conversation on Latinx workers in our food system. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. Destination, New York. So the next conversation will focus on workers, Latinx workers here in New York City. When Omar first approached me about the possibility of creating a series of discussions on the recasting of Latinx immigrants as essential workers, one of my first thoughts was bringing these two brilliant Latinas together, Larissa Garzon and Perla Guerrero, to have a conversation about the topic. I thought to myself, I'd like to be a fly in the wall when they meet and they actually talk. So these two women work in and on the American South. We knew that the conversation, because of their Southern focus, had a lot to teach us. Several months ago, I met Larissa Garzon, the executive director of the Piscopo Farmworkers Ministry. We were collaborating on a project with Sam Vong, a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. He felt it really necessary that we actually work with a community organization like the ministry to document the lives and the contours and the impact of being food workers in the food system, basically in an ag community. She not only opened their doors, but she gave us an opportunity to have meaningful interactions with her team of fantastic organizers and with the community that they work with. And for her, these two categories were not mutually exclusive. She explained to me that her job was to empower community members to become organizers and leaders, and really to make the change that they wanted to see. The time I spent with the ministry, I basically saw that in action. I saw women organizing food pantries, clothing drives, preparing care packages for women, made by women. I worked a long time on documenting stories of agricultural workers, but I'd never seen the careful diligence of this kind of grassroots work. In part, these care packages included necessary items that many of us take for granted, such as sanitary napkins that are expensive and hard to come by in the agricultural fields or the packing houses that shape the area. Larissa explained to me that for her organization, agricultural work was not just the fields, but also the poultry farms, the processing facilities, and a whole ag world that was interconnected. I learned so much from her in a short amount of time that I knew that she really just is a natural teacher and should be teaching all of us. So I was elated that she accepted the invitation. Perla Guerrero is a very good friend, and I admire her work deeply. She's an associate professor of American Studies and Latinx Studies at the University of Maryland. She's an amazing scholar of immigration and interethnic relations in the South. Her wonderful book, Nuevo South, Asians, Latinos, and the Remaking of Place has shifted the conversation in Latinx studies, pushing us to rethink the American South and the place of Latinx and Asian immigrants in its past and in its present. In one chapter, she takes us into the poultry processing plants, better known as polleras, and she traces how Mexicans and Latinos got there. And she also traces the dangerous contours of this line of work. So I was elated when she emailed, yes, I'll do this. So now let's welcome our lovely panelists, and I'll turn the virtual mic to Larissa.
Thank you, Mireya, so much for those very kind words. I really appreciate them. And thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you. Would you like me to start speaking a little bit about what we do? All right,
please.
So I work with the Piscopo Farmworker Ministry. We're an organization that's based in rural Eastern North Carolina, where farm workers and other agricultural workers live and work. Our organization started in 1982, and we've been there for all these years doing different programs. I want to share with you some images about the work that we do, and just give you a little bit more information about that community that we work with. So, I'm sorry, let me just start it here. There you go. So at the ministry, we work with workers that work in the field, packing houses, nurseries, and meat processing plants. Most of them are Latin American immigrants. Some of them have children that were born in the United States. And so a lot of the families that we work with have mixed immigration status, which means some of the community members are documented and some are undocumented. We also work with guest workers and with seasonal workers. So I wanted to start with some vocabulary, some definitions that might help put some context for the information that we're going to share today. These terms sometimes are similar, and so they can be a little bit confusing. Immigrants are people who come from another country to live and work in the U.S. They can be either documented or undocumented. Undocumented means that you don't have official permission from the U.S. government to live and work here. Documented people do have that, and it's usually some paperwork. Migrant workers are people who either cross state lines or country lines to go somewhere else to work. The best definition that I ever heard of a migrant worker are people who, at the end of the workday, can't go to sleep in their own bed at home. So if you work all day and you get to go to your apartment, to your own bed, that means you're not a migrant worker. Easy. H-2A workers are migrant workers, but these are workers that are migrating from other countries to work in agriculture, in temporary jobs to the United States with the H-2A visa. It's a visa that is granted for maybe a month, 11 months. Usually here in North Carolina, the average is 6 to 7 months. Workers come to the US and they pick our food, they harvest the tobacco plant, they tend to the plants, they do everything so that we can have food on our table. Seasonal workers are the opposite of a migrant worker. These are the workers that live and work in the community for the whole year. Farm workers are the people who work in farms harvesting our food, and agricultural workers include all the other categories that I mentioned before. I hope this is helpful as I move forward with the presentation. So some of the main challenges for the community are immigration status, the exclusion from worker protections enjoyed by other workers. This is specifically regarding farm workers. Sub-poverty wages, hazardous working conditions, substandard housing. Children and women have their own issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Lack of access to education and human trafficking. So one of the things that we do at the ministry since 2018 is that we have a disaster relief program, because we had 2 major hurricanes hit the state in that year. And so this is just 2 examples of how we respond to the crisis, right? Because the workers and the families that we work with are earning sub-poverty wages, it's really hard to recover from a disaster. Well, here we see that we can go in person and talk to people and provide the help that they need. As you can imagine, any crisis will highlight the inequalities and the challenges that people are already experiencing. Substandard housing is going to suffer more when there's a hurricane. The house is going to be in worse state than before the hurricane. If you earn poverty wages, you're not going to have savings to fix your home, or maybe to feed your family while you're out of work because the crops are damaged. Access to healthcare, isolation, exploitation, discrimination, these are all things that are going to be highlighted by disasters. So in the case of COVID-19 over here, we see that the response that we have to do is a lot different, where we can't have one-on-one contact with the community. If we give them any type of donations, we have to put them in their cars, or if we go to farm worker camps, like the picture on the left, we really can't have any close contact with the workers. Any type of crisis in a community like the one that we work with is going to create a financial crisis, but also a mental health crisis. So that's one thing that I hope everybody can take with them, is that our community is already really traumatized because of the separation of families and immigration enforcement and poverty and the trauma of migration and, you know, the exploitation that people deal with every day at work, and the discrimination that people feel in restaurants and in their everyday life. And so when there's a major crisis like a hurricane or a pandemic, things tend to become a little bit worse in terms of our collective and individual trauma. So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about how this is different in the disasters. So for COVID-19, farm workers have had less work because they don't get unemployment and they don't get stimulus money like every other person in the US does. Or not every other person, but the majority of us do. There's less work because farmers didn't plant as much this year. They didn't hire as many people, and they're enforcing, physical distance. And then in terms of mental health, some of the main issues are that people are living in, like I said, in camps. For the guest workers, they live in housing that is provided by the employer. And so they live and work with the same coworkers that they work with all day. And they're in small spaces. So they're very vulnerable to the virus, but they're also isolated. And now they don't have as much mobility as they did before. The families, they live in multi-family housing or multi-generational housing. And so it makes them really vulnerable as well. They have a lot of fear regarding their immigration status, the lack of protection equipment at work, and also of losing their jobs. And for people in meat processing plants, this is even worse because there's areas of the plant where you're forced to work shoulder to shoulder with your coworkers, and there's not transparency about the numbers. And so there's lots of rumors that make it really scary for people to go to work. Most people have expressed to me that they have to make a choice. Either they have the opportunity to earn money to feed their families, or they expose their lives, they expose their health to the virus by going to work. So I wanted to share some pictures of the substandard housing that I was talking about. This is a farm worker camp in North Carolina. It's housing provided by the employer. And usually in a camp, you can have a camp where there's 3 workers that live there, or you can have camps where there's like 500 workers who live there. As you can see, some of the conditions are really deplorable. The housing standards in North Carolina are not as good as the housing standards in other states. For example, privacy in the bathrooms is not required, and instead of bathrooms, it's allowed to have outhouses. Mattresses were not required until a few years ago. The law also doesn't require a lot of space, a lot of room. Workers don't have private homes or private bathrooms, and usually it's just a lot of people in a small space. This is an example of the laundry facilities provided by one of the employers. They are not allowed to do this, but I thought it was an interesting picture where there's just some buckets and a hose and a brush. Of course, when something like this happens, it's really important to know that the conditions that the workers live in, just everything becomes worse during a pandemic or during a disaster. We're really worried because right now, we know that there's going to be a hurricane coming, and with the pandemic, we're worried about the safety of workers that need to be taken out of these houses into shelters. Would you like me to keep going?
I think it's wonderful. I think this is exactly what we should be learning more about the conditions. And I think you're doing an excellent job of showing us basically the impact of COVID versus other natural disasters.
Yeah, I would like to say that right now, it's really interesting how a lot of families are out of work, and we call them essential workers. But they're out of work, and because they can't get unemployment or the stimulus money, they're really struggling to get by. Sometimes, these workers weren't hired because guest workers were brought earlier because farmers were scared that the immigration system was going to shut down. And so we have some overworked H-2A workers and some local workers without work. And so we can see how the food system is very complicated. The whole system doesn't make sense sometimes. What we could do in order to support these communities right now, obviously, I would say that you should support any type of local organization, especially if it's worker-led, any type of organization that is organizing to improve the conditions for immigrants and farm workers in rural areas, but also that everyone on this call should support programs where farmers guarantee things like good wages, good working conditions, responsible pesticide use. We should also advocate so that our governments have in their budget funds that can work to improve the enforcement of the protections that workers have, and also support fair and humane immigration reform, oppose the separation of families, the detention of immigrants, advocate for institution and living wages. Something that people don't know is that in the 1930s, due to the legacy of slavery and racism in the United States, farm workers and domestic workers were excluded from some of the protections that all of the other workers in the U.S. enjoy. And so to this day, farm workers are not paid overtime. If you work in a small farm with less than 10 full-time workers, you're not entitled to minimum wage. Children as young as 12 years old can work in the fields. Farm workers don't enjoy the right to organize without retaliation. So basically, they don't have the protection to organize in the workplace. And a lot of the employers are also, except for the H-2A workers, they're not required to provide workers' comp. And so all of these conditions make it so that when there's a pandemic, things are a lot harder.
I'm glad that you point out these basically structural reasons why farm workers are some of our most vulnerable workers. I mean, this is a long legacy of keeping, certain racialized populations trapped in work that is low paid, dangerous, not highly valued. And beyond that, I think very few people know that it is one of the few industries that still has children working in the fields. The children still pick the last number I saw about 4 years ago, was a quarter of our produce. So, I think all of the things that you're really articulating and talking about are reasons why we really need to take a much more drastic measures really in reforming labor and reforming the way we see workers throughout our food system. And as you say, I mean, how essential are they if we aren't protecting them?
Yeah, I just want to jump on here and say that I think it's also telling that even in this moment where agricultural workers and folks that work in the meatpacking industry are designated essential workers, it's very clear, given the laws, federal and state, that these are workers that we don't value. This is work that we don't value, even as we obviously depend on it, right? Whether we're vegan, vegetarian, rabid meat eaters, we all depend on human beings to pick and pack and pluck our food. And yet, as a society, before COVID, we have not cared very much about their working conditions, about labor rights, about child exploitation. And I think, like Larissa said, this moment really really exacerbates those structural vulnerabilities that already existed in food and in agriculture and in meatpacking. And as the conversation continues, I really want to talk a little bit about, what we can do and what that looks like when we actually value the human beings that are doing this job, other jobs, right? I mean, in short, I think it would be more protections, higher salaries, changing federal policy so that they have more rights, more defenses, et cetera. So we can get to that, but I think I just wanted to point that out.
Perla, do you want to basically tell us a little bit about how you feel, sketch out for us a bit of the work that your book does in terms of, how did Latinos get to these places in the South, and how do we understand their place in the food system via a Southern landscape that renders Southern cuisine as a very different topic of conversation than food workers?
Right. Absolutely. So in order to really understand the way that Latinx people became such a large part of Southern agricultural workers, it's important to understand that, of course, Texas and Florida have a different history than the rest of the former Confederate states. They've had Latinx populations since before the United States was founded as a country. So in my book, I put a pin in Texas and Florida, a very different history, Texas with the Southwest more broadly, and then Florida with the Caribbean. So we're really talking about other Southern states besides those two. And though there had been small pockets of migration through farm work, guest workers, for example, as our colleague Julie Weiss shows in her book, Corazón de Dixie, guest workers, braceros were brought into Arkansas during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when the bracero program existed. But in my research, I found that most of them didn't stay. Braceros went to Arkansas, worked, and then left. They dispersed. Braceros also tended to have worked in the southeast part of the state versus the northwest part of the state, which borders Missouri and Oklahoma. And the reason this is important is because in the 1990s, for Arkansas specifically, there was a boom in poultry work specifically because Tyson headquarters is in Springdale. It also was vertically integrating and creating a structure, an infrastructure, so that the feedlot and the chicken hens and the manufacturing plants were all in a certain mile radius in Arkansas. And so in the 1990s, there's a couple of things that happened. California, nationally, there's a recession that hits California particularly hard due to a decrease in manufacturing, and people lose their jobs, my dad included, and it was a very tough economic moment. And because people had circulated through Arkansas and through other parts of the South, North Carolina, Georgia, they started kind of testing out staying in the places where they had previously only engaged in migrant work, right? Transitory work. So through social networks, people are like, hey, there are jobs in Arkansas, hay trabajo en polleras, you should come out, right? And so a lot of people engage in that migration. The South offered a lower cost of living than states like, say, Texas or California or Illinois. It offered a more rural setting in a lot of places for folks that wanted less of an urban life. It also offered then, in the late 90s, early 2000s, a fairly kind of comparable wage given the cost of living in the region. And so there were all these factors that really made it so that Latinx people in particular really were pulled to work in the area through poultry, beef less so in the South, but pork as well. And they really established a life for themselves and became integral in the industry itself. Now, Latinx people are often touted as having a really great work ethic, right? That immigrant work ethic. But the flip side of that optimistic version is that, yes, Latinx people are hard workers, but if you look at why they're hard workers, is because they are structurally vulnerable, right? They might not speak English as fluently as other workers. They might be undocumented. They might, even if they're legal permanent residents, maybe they don't have experience working in other areas. And so there's a particular vulnerability that leads them to suck up whatever working conditions are happening in the poultry plants, whatever working conditions are happening in the fields, because they have very limited options. So the poultry industry, one of the arguments that I make and others have made as well, is that the poultry industry, really the boom of the industry, was built on the backs of Latinx laborers in particular, especially those who were undocumented. They're particularly hyper vulnerable to wage theft, to even though they're legally protected from certain actions that happen in a plant, they're afraid of what pursuing that action would mean for them. So there's a whole lot of factors that came together in the 90s and 2000s that really made the region a dynamic site of growth for Latinx people.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think you're right that there are a lot of dynamics at the state level, the local level, but also the national level that lead to these industries either growing, expanding, or shifting in these regions. Some have to do with, right to work states. Other things that come into play are vertical integration and the ease to put these things in proximity and to bring workers that may work sometime in one portion of this, system, and then in another moment in another portion of the system. We actually have several questions, so I'm actually going to start looking into the Q&As, and the first one I'm going to combine two questions. You have basically two questions, Larissa. Whether or not you can share a little bit more about the breakdown of country of origins in the community that you work with in Dunn, North Carolina, Central American, South American, Mexico. And then the other thing is folks really want to know a little bit more about the experience of women in this context.
Yeah, so the majority of the people in our community are Central Americans and Mexicans. The vast majority of the H-2A workers are from Mexico, with a few workers from Guatemala. It's really hard to get very reliable numbers, I think, is the question that I get asked the most, is how many people are there, how many workers live in North Carolina, from what countries, what is their immigration status. I can't tell you that, but what I can tell you is that, like I said, it's a very vibrant community, and even though they're all Latinos, they come with their own cultures and their own contributions, you know, to the community. The second question was about women. Unfortunately, women have to face very specific challenges related to sexual harassment at work and also discrimination. So we know that a lot of the women, unfortunately, are not given supervision positions. Sometimes they're paid less. And many times they do report sexual harassment in the workplace, either done by their coworkers or by their supervisors. So they're very vulnerable. We recently did a little bandana project on Facebook where some of the women in the community drew pictures raising awareness about this issue, since some of them were directly affected about it.
Another question we have is basically about the major agricultural corporations that employ undocumented immigrants in North Carolina. Folks want to know, is it meatpacking, poultry? What are basically the main employers?
Undocumented immigrants are everywhere. There's a chance that you know one.
I know many.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, I think that there's some industries like agriculture where there's a lot of undocumented immigrants, but they work in restaurants, they work at universities, they work in many different places. So chances are there's employers in probably every industry that hire undocumented workers. Here in North Carolina, like everywhere else in the United States, the majority of farm workers are undocumented. The H-2A program, which is the guest worker program, is growing exponentially, but it still hasn't caught up to the undocumented population that is still picking our fruits and vegetables and bringing food to our table. Mm-hmm. In the case of the meat processing plants, there are Latinos there who are documented, who are undocumented, immigrants from other countries. There's a lot of Haitians around here that work in meat processing plants, and also African-American and white workers who are also at the plants. So the meat processing plants are really more of a mix, whereas when you look at the fields, they tend to be Latinos for the most part.
And what about basically the poultry raising facilities and everything connected to the actual animal before it gets there? How would you describe those? Are those primarily Latino?
Yes, people who work in animal farms are primarily Latinos. There's a lot of our community leaders who work tending to the animals when they're before they're taken to the meat processing plants. And they tend to be seasonal workers, which means that they live in the community year round. The guest worker visa doesn't apply for animal farms because those jobs are not temporary. So they're year-long jobs where, you know, the animals need to be fed for the whole year. They need to be taken care of for the whole year. So it's only seasonal stuff like harvesting, you know, during the agricultural season.
We have so many great questions. It's hard to choose, but I'm going to go through some of them. Perla, would you be able to comment? I mean, I know that someone's asking, could you comment on how the Mexican consulates are intervening in these issues of workers? And I know partly some of your work, I mean, there is a history of consulates doing this work, but I guess I'm wondering, what is the contemporary limit? What do we know about the past and the present role of the consulates?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So in an earlier time period, or again, around the 1930s, 1940s, through the Bracero program in the 1960s, the Mexican consulates were more active. Again, this is also in Julie Weiss's book, Corazón de Dixie. They were more involved in protecting the rights of Mexican nationals. that has shifted since the 1960s, unless something is quite quite exploitative. I mean, to the level of human rights violations that a lot of meat work does actually violate a lot of human rights stuff, but it's couched within a discourse of labor, and so that discussion kind of makes it so that to the public, right, and to advocates, it's less it's less threatening or less horrible than, let's say, sex work, right? There's a kind of morality to what we pay attention to as something that is a human rights violation. So from the mid 20th century to the present, the Mexican consulates have by and large not gotten involved in any significant level to advocate for their citizens who are living in the United States. Larissa might have more information, but I think the other thing that also kind of illustrates that is that there's a shift nationally in the mid 20th century that has connections to other issues like immigration laws, the kind of visas the United States is giving out at any particular moment that really shifts migration from Latin America to the United States. And so there's a greater set of factors that come together to make it so that Mexican nationals working in any number of jobs where they're being exploited to great degrees don't have protections from their embassies. We can, that also gets into like foreign policy, and does Mexico want to step on the United States' toes as their economies are so integrated and increasingly integrating? Those are some of the larger factors that I think account for the rather kind of meek position that the Mexican government and the consulates particularly have taken to guest worker or Mexican nationals being exploited in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So we have really great questions about racism and xenophobia and how it works against immigrant communities and basically these workers. How does racism relate to those structural conditions that you're mentioning? I think this question goes more so to how does race, shape the structural conditions, but also contemporary capitalism? Because this is a project of racial capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. Turn it to the panelists. What do y'all think?
Well, like I said before, I think that the current conditions for farm workers are the result of slavery being at the foundation of agriculture in this country. Slaves were working in the fields, the slaves were working, taking care of the homes. And so in the 1930s, after, all these history of racism, when the labor laws are passed, farm workers are excluded, right? And farm workers continue to be African Americans until about the 1970s, when the population starts shifting to immigrants. And, immigrants are facing some of the same challenges that African Americans were facing when they were working in agriculture. As a matter of fact, there's documentaries that show housing here in North Carolina being the same housing that population being used right now by our current workers. So what I can say in terms of like how this affects the community, I would say if you talk to anybody in our community and you ask them what would be the number one thing that you would like changed, they would say immigration reform. Many workers, and this is an interesting state to work at, because this is right to work state. This is an anti-union state. This is a state where there's not a lot of protections for workers. And so farm workers and workers at meat processing plants don't really feel empowered, don't really feel taken into account. They don't feel like they're being listened to. They don't feel like they are cared for by society or by the government. So that's why it's really important that we address these issues at a policy level so that they're changed. One of the other things I guess I would like to say is in terms of the racism and the xenophobia during a pandemic, it affects every aspect of somebody's life. And so when access to healthcare is already limited, like it is for farm workers, for immigrants in rural areas, in the middle of a pandemic, that's even worse, you know, because you need to be tested, because you need interpreters to tell you what is happening, because you need somebody to check in with you when you're in quarantine. And so when the structures that are around us are themselves, you know, racist, because all of them are, it becomes a systemic challenge to access just the basic information that you need in a time like this.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think part of it is looking at these problems structurally. And I think oftentimes we think of racism on such an individual level that we don't step back and actually look at how the structures, institutions reproduce racism and this kind of racial bias. And in the medical establishment, we see that constantly. We see these workers basically go into facilities and complain about pain and really be told that there's nothing wrong with them, even though they're in pain. Are you seeing more of this now, this kind of struggle to access the actual healthcare?
Yeah, we actually know that in some counties it's so hard for Latinos to get tested that they have to drive to a neighbor county where they will actually receive the services that they need, because for some reason, some places are just not providing that to the community. We also hear about workers who are so terrified that they're going to miss work, that they have made agreements with their coworkers who they work with and live with, because these are H-2A workers. They've made agreements that if somebody gets sick, they'll just abandon the camp instead of looking for healthcare, because they don't want to jeopardize work for the rest of the crew. You would think that's not like access to healthcare, but it actually is an issue of access to healthcare. If you don't have enough money and you're earning poverty wages, you know, and your whole family depends on it, we need to do better as a society to provide incentives for these workers to get the healthcare that they need. We're also hearing a lot about the issue of interpretation and testing facilities and clinics not having Spanish speakers. And of course, there's no guaranteed free testing. And so for a family to pay $350 per test when that is the equivalent of 2 months of rent, you know, it acts as a reason why people don't look for the help that they need. So we are hearing a lot about access to healthcare. And, you know, one of the things that we would like the government to do is to ensure that all workers could get testing, that all workers could get paid while they're in quarantine, and that it's free.
I mean, one issue that I remember a lot of members of your community talking about, Larissa, was, you know, the inability to even access driver's license, which then makes it much more costly to get to the doctor, and the lack of public transportation. And so I'm wondering, you know, during COVID, how is even transportation to healthcare facilities happening?
Yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges. I think specifically for migrant workers, because they often don't have their own vehicles. And so they depend 100% on their employer or supervisor to take them anywhere. So I know of a couple of cases where that has been an issue, where even the outreach workers that provide healthcare services to these workers don't have the kind of transportation and protection equipment that they need to take these workers to get tested, or even to take them to the hospital when they're already very sick. So lack of transportation is another big issue. Language barrier, finances, racism, discrimination. Again, all the things that are already part of the community's life become more dangerous during this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Perla, you have a question here. about basically thoughts on the relationship between Latinx agricultural workers and refugee workers. In many places like Greenlee and Aurora, Colorado, refugee workers are now perceived as a legal labor frontier to the undocumented Latinx workers. Has this discourse come to roust in the South? And what are the effects for Latinx food system workers? Are they forming alliances? I mean, your work directly talks to these kind of intra-ethnic tensions and politics, and basically these sites that have really dynamic, multifaceted immigrant communities that that at times, seem to articulate, a real kind of challenge to the perceptions of what those communities, the history of those communities.
Right. Thank you. So that's a great question. And one of the things to keep in mind when we're talking, even though we're talking about the South, right? The South is not monolithic. It's very diverse from not just state to state, but corner to corner. So when I first started working on my project on Latinx and Asian people in the South, I would often get a question about, what does the Black community think of these workers, right? Are Latinx people taking jobs from the Black community? And I had to, that pushed me to really answer that question. And when I started looking at the numbers, at the census information, let's say for the 1980s, a part of Arkansas that is Northwest Arkansas, where Tyson Foods is headquartered. Tyson Foods is one of the world's largest meat producers. Was that part of the state was overwhelmingly white. There were entire counties where there was not one single African-American person in that county, right? Versus other parts of the state that had 100,000, 160,000 African-Americans. The Northwest Quadrant had less than 10,000 African-Americans, and 80% of them lived in one county in one city, which is where the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, the flagship campus, the university system, is held. So many of them were actually college students. So in doing this research and following the historical threads, what I realized is that the reason why that part of Arkansas did not have a vibrant African-American community is because they were run out of that part of the state. There were lynchings that happened at the turn of the 20th century in 1905 and 1909, I believe. And the Black communities that had been present there were run off, right? Through lynchings, through burnings. Maybe some of you have heard about the Tulsa race riot. That Tulsa's just 2 hours away from Northwest Arkansas. So this was a kind of sub-regional theme manifestation at the turn of the 20th century. So what that meant when Latinx people started arriving in the 80s and 90s in substantive numbers is that this area was very white. Initially, Latinx people kind of, circling a little bit back to that question about racism and xenophobia, initially Latinx people were seen as kind of birds of passage, right? They were kind of exotic. It's like, oh, teach me to count to Spanish, uno, dos, tres, right? I've conquered, my bilingual skills. And people Arkansans really started freaking out when it was clear that Latinx people were settling in the state, were establishing roots, were buying houses, were going to Walmart. And that's when you start to see a real push against their use of public space, right? And I think there are so many threads that this kind of illustrates, right? In this moment of COVID, there are so many anti-Asian attacks for these racialized understandings of where this virus comes from, right? Latinx people in Arkansas had similar attacks in terms of slurs or just, like people reacting negatively towards them simply for being out in public, for using public space, not misusing, not breaking laws, not doing anything different, but actually just going to Walmart and shopping, going to the park and playing soccer instead of football. And a lot of Arkansans said, why the park's so different now. Like if it could be what it used to be, then I wouldn't mind them being here. If they were just in their house, and I wouldn't mind. And of course, the expectation then is that Latinx people hide, right? That you become invisible, that you don't get to know your neighbors, that you don't assimilate into Arkansas, the natural state, which enjoys its outdoors, etc. So on the one hand, that's what happened with Latinx laborers. Now, Arkansas, the reason I became slightly obsessed with Arkansas is because it turns out that before Latinx, specifically Mexican immigrant laborers, there was already a Asian American community. There was a Vietnamese community, Vietnamese, Lao, Cambodian, Hmong, to very small numbers in Arkansas, because they had been allowed to enter the United States as refugees at the end of the Vietnam War. And so this community, the Southeast Asian community, had also worked in poultry plants. Some people still worked in poultry plants when Latinos arrived, and they became coworkers. Now, the thing for folks who haven't read very much about this or haven't ever worked in manufacturing something like poultry is that there are a couple of things working against you. One is a language barrier, right? A lot of Southeast Asian immigrants in particular, or refugees, have some of the, come from very like working class roots. In this way, they're quite similar to Mexican and Central American immigrants. So there's a low proficiency of English from both groups. So you have language as an obstacle to even communicate. And yet people found ways to like share their food and kind of be neighborly. But the lines are set up to move inhumanely fast. I think right now it's up to 140 birds per minute. So you don't have time to chit chat. You don't have time to even say hello or wave. The processing plants are also quite loud, depending, from work site to work site, are quite loud. And even in places where the work itself is at a low volume, employers will often blast music precisely to prevent workers from forming that kind of close reciprocal relationship, right? A friendship that might come out, right? So there's this certain kind of cohabitation in that Latinx people live next to, for example, now Springdale, Arkansas is also home to the largest Marshallese community outside of the Marshall Islands. So you have another vulnerable group that is also at risk for being hyper exploitable, and they're living together, but there are language differences, but their kids go to school together and hang out. And so there's a certain kind of closeness that can occur, but always or frequently a language barrier that really prevents people from coming together. And then you add to immigrant groups or refugee groups an ignorance about US history, especially African-American history and labor history. And then you start to see fissures, because then our community start buying into the idea that we're doing either things the right way, or our work ethic is proving that despite our undocumented status, we deserve to be here, unlike these other people who don't do the work, right? And these other people tend to be racialized as Black, as African-Americans, right? For many Latinx immigrants, the argument is like, well, our issue might be that we don't have documentation, but they're citizens and they speak English. And why is it that they haven't advanced, right? I think this is the real kind of wall that we hit when we're talking about trying to get communities together. We don't understand each other's histories. And I think that's also part of the structural inequality. Our work sites are not going to allow us to learn from each other, because then we might actually see one another's humanity. We might recognize each other's struggle and really kind of show up for each other. And I think this is part of the work that so many Southern labor organizations are doing, to get workers to speak to one another, to have those really tough conversations about race and about immigration, so that we come to an understanding about who we are and how we can move together forward.
I think it's well put. I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings, and I think you are very right. There's not enough opportunity to actually have dialogue and to actually have a convivial atmosphere where people have exchange that, in which people can not only see their humanity, but people can actually organize. We have a really great question from our friend, Dr. Sam Vong. How are current deportation policies affecting agricultural workers during this crisis. What do you think these policies will have impact on the agricultural industry in the long term? So how do we see these deportation regimes? I mean,
Right.
it's really hard to sort of accept the reality that these workers are lauded as essential when they're simultaneously also being targeted for deportation.
Right. So this is a really complex problem, right? H-2A workers, Larissa has much more information on, I'm sure, but as long as H-2A workers have their permit, they have certain protections, they follow the law, they're safe, right? So when we're talking about deportation, by and large, we're talking about people who are either entered the United States as undocumented or entered the United States on a visa or some other entry that initially allowed for a legal presence, and then they overstayed that permit, right? They overstayed their visa. At the moment in which you overstay your visa, you become undocumented. And one of the things that's really, I'm gonna say interesting, although that's not quite the word I'm looking for, I guess telling in terms of the South specifically, is that when you look at counties that have entered into agreements with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or the Department of Homeland Security, programs like 287G, which deputize local law enforcement to act as ICE officials and to put people immediately into deportation proceedings, or Secure Communities, which is a program where if a local law enforcement officer stops me, let's say, stops me, they run my print against the FBI database and under Secure Communities also through the ICE database. So they can't detain me necessarily on the spot as ICE officials, but they can say, oh, this person's undocumented, we need to follow up with her. So when you look at those two programs, there are a lot of southern counties that have signed agreements with the federal government to participate in these programs. So this means, in addition to all these issues about exploitation, about driver's licenses, about getting access to healthcare, people are really aware of the fact that they are trapped, right? They really are aware that at any moment they might be stopped for walking, for driving, for suspicious activity. That for immigrants, it's unlikely they will be killed by officers, but it's more likely for Latinx immigrants, it's more likely that they're gonna be put their immigration status will be severely questioned, right? And so I'm starting a new project on deportees and returnees to Mexico, and it's quite telling to me that of the folks I've talked to, there's a very small sample, right? There's still an overrepresentation of Latinx Southerners. These are folks who grew up in Georgia, South Carolina, Oklahoma, which is, kind of on that southern border-ish situation. They're overrepresented, right? Versus folks who grew up in California or Illinois, right? That have very large numbers of Latinx communities, of undocumented people, and yet they're not the folks that are being put on deportation flights, right? So when we're talking about structural inequality, we also have to think about these larger issues beyond wage and labor to immigration laws, and now a deportation regime that is on steroids. As a final thought, one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind when we're talking about labor is also, like scholar Nicholas DeGeneva has argued, deportation works to essentially discipline a worker, to threaten them with if you step out of line, if you make any waves, we're going to deport you. But actually it's more the threat of deportation and living under that kind of scared regime, because part of the way deportation works is that if you threaten workers, then they will be more likely to acquiesce, to not fight against certain exploitations, wage theft. And so it's the threat of deportation that works in tandem with deporting people as well, right? Like deportation actually works to keep some people here, but under much more vulnerable conditions.
You know, and I think it's really interesting that you point out that tension in terms of deportation and workers being able to speak up. And I think that you're right, that there's a deportation regime that's disciplining people. And I think part of the issue that at least I see, at least in the food system and agricultural work, and you know, that's what I focus on, is that there's always this discussion of a perceived labor shortage. And I'm constantly being asked about H-2A programs. And as an expert of the largest temporary guest worker program, it's always shocking when people hear me say over and over, guest worker programs do not work, because they basically prime somebody to always be in fear of deportation or in contract termination. And it always creates an uneven playing field. And it's not so much that these jobs are difficult jobs, because the common thing I hear is these are such hard jobs. Americans won't do them. Americans do crazy difficult jobs. The problem is they want to be compensated and they want to be protected. And that's a tension that I think that we are not willing to address. And so when you say these communities learn to hold on to the moniker of worker, I'm a good worker, I think it's because that's the way the society, societal discourse values them, as solely laborers, not as I'm a good singer, artist, dancer. No, I'm a good worker. And I know, Larissa, you have a lot more experience with H-2A workers and with these worlds that basically, in which H-2A workers are in some ways displacing undocumented workers.
Yeah, I think that an important thing to mention about the H-2A visa is that you are tied to your employer. The visa is tied to the employer. And so it doesn't work like when I go to work for a supermarket, if I don't like it there, I can go to the next corner and get a job at the next supermarket where they're going to treat me better and pay me better wages. For H-2A workers, they come here with a contract that is tied to the employer, whether it's a farmer or a labor contractor, and they don't have the freedom to shop for a better place to live and to work. So what that does is that it definitely incentivizes people to not raise their voices when there's abuse, when there's wage theft, even when there's human trafficking. So human trafficking being a big problem in agriculture. And specifically with H-2A workers. Most people think human trafficking happens mainly to undocumented people, but in fact, it's H-2A workers who are the most vulnerable. I would like to say, just as a comment from the conversation you guys just had, that sometimes because of all this oppression, two things can happen. One is that people say, well, why don't undocumented immigrants and H-2A workers ask for help? You know, it's almost like they get blamed for not accessing resources. And so I just want to bring up again that there's this collective trauma that we're experiencing as communities, where we've had so many bad experiences with healthcare, with the police, with institutions, you know, that it makes it so that we only trust a very small group of people in the community that offer help. In our case, we get people who drive 2 hours to our office to get food because they don't want to go to the local food bank because they don't trust them. So, you know, for anybody who works with a community, it just really helps to think about that, to think about like the everyday microaggressions, the racism, the institutional stuff that we're facing. And the other thing is sometimes people look at the community and they say, oh, pobrecitos, like I feel so bad for them. I feel so sorry for them. Like that's not what the community needs or wants. The community is facing horrible issues, but they still have power. They have collective power as workers. They have power as individuals. They contribute to society. Many people are organizing. We should support them instead of feeling bad for them. At the policy level also, some of the ways in which local government tries to protect workers is very paternalistic. Even the employers sometimes, the growers, will say very paternalistic things. It's not uncommon for me to go to a camp and hear about my boys. My boys this, my boys don't like visitors. My boys you know, this or that. And so, you know, we need to kind of fight that urge to protect adult men and women from the community. It's more like standing with them and walking with them as opposed to fixing things for them. And I say this because during the pandemic, certain things have made me really uncomfortable. Like one of the proposals here in North Carolina was that, you know, we don't want 40 workers from a camp to go to Walmart on Sunday to go shopping because, you know, they might get sick or people might discriminate against them, as if that wasn't happening already. So we're going to let the employer choose one person to go shopping for the whole group. And so, you know, I get the that they want to do the right thing for workers, that they want to protect workers, but in reality, what that's doing is isolating workers even more, taking away the only outing that they have on Sundays, because the rest of the week they work and they just go from the farm to the camp, from the farm to the camp. And also, you know, this is an industry where there's a lot of fraudulent food sales by employers, labor contractors, the wives of labor contractors, the supervisors. So what you're doing is telling workers, you can't buy your own food anymore. You're going to have to buy from this person. You're going to have to give your hard-earned money to somebody who might charge you more or who has a history of charging you more. So, you know, in terms of like racism and what this feels like on an everyday life, we just need to be really careful about how we can be allies and how we can hold the government accountable, because otherwise they're going to continue to do things that they think is a good idea, but they never ask workers. And workers are now helpless. They're organizing despite not having protections to organize, and they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
And I think,
oh, I just want to jump in really quick to say that what Larissa mentions about them, the workers being denied the ability to go shopping for themselves, not only is it infantilizing, but it's also a way to keep them hidden, right? Because then any group of 40 people, I don't care who they are going to draw attention to themselves, right? Especially if you are walking out of, you know, 8 trucks or whatever, right? All driving up at the same time. This is a way to keep workers hidden. And I think, you know, for another conversation, there is a conversation to be had about the use of space and the policing of space. And each community faces that structural violence differently. But I think for Latinx immigrants in particular, or Latinx people in particular, especially in certain labor work, it's extra policing about where they can be, right? Can they even go to Walmart to buy their food? And in Arkansas, by around 2005, there were reports, and you might still find them online somewhere if you want to look that up, where people were like, don't go to this Walmart, don't go to the Walmart in Rogers on Saturday because that's quote unquote Mexican hour, right? So this had nothing, in that case, it isn't about undocumented people. You can't tell who's undocumented, right? It's just the fact that brown people, Mexican people, Latinx people were deigning to use a company, right, to take up space. And I think that's really important. And I also wanted to say, Larissa, that maybe this is a good moment for you, since you're talking about workers organizing, to kind of tell us a little bit more about what you're doing, fundraising, how people can support.
So my organization is basically a community center where we have 12 different programs, direct services, leader development programs, advocacy programs. And during this crisis, what we have done is that we only focus on 4 issues. One is access to food, because ironically, the people who work in agriculture during this crisis can't feed their own families. And so we have a food distribution program. You saw some pictures before. We're feeding about 300 families every week, or every other week, sorry. We also have mental health services for free for anybody who wants to access them in Spanish, over the phone or Zoom. And we have immigration services as well. But one of the main things, and I just wanted to share my screen again, is an emergency fund that we created to provide 100 families with $500 to help them out. Because as I mentioned before, a lot of these workers don't have unemployment. Well, none of the ones that apply to our fund have unemployment. And they also don't have access to the $1,200 that the government is helping other workers with. And so if y'all go to our Facebook, you can see some of the testimonies. I'm sharing them right now. These are some of the families who benefited from the fund. And of course, we know that $500 is a drop in the bucket. But for these families, we hope that we're making a big difference. And, you know, anybody can contribute to the fund. If they go to our website, they can make a donation. Or if there's any emergency funds in your community that are helping undocumented people, I really want to encourage you to give, because the community is really going through a crisis right now. And sometimes giving people a little bit of help can go a long way. I really like this quote from this man who received the help, because I like how he says, like, we are just like other workers. You know, we also need help during this crisis. So again, you don't have to support the ministry. You can if you want, but look for immigrant rights groups in your areas, engage with them, get to know the community, form long-lasting relationships so that you can show up for them when things get hard, and they can show up for you when things get hard.
Yeah. And I want to plug Venceremos, which is out of Arkansas. Venceremos, VENCEREMOS. You can find their Facebook page under Venceremos, or on Twitter by Venceremos AR. This is an organization that is led by Magali Licoli, who is Latinx, a badass Latinx woman. And they're really pushing for their rights. Right? I mean, I think oftentimes we know that the South is against union organizing, it's not for worker safety and better salaries, but there's resistance, right? There's pockets of organizing that are happening from Arkansas to North Carolina to Georgia, where workers are really advocating for themselves, using their power, standing together. But each location, I think, you know, each place has its own battle, right? And I think sometimes when we can identify one location, then we feel much more invested versus like signing an online petition to ask Tyson to improve their salaries, right? To have like hazard pay. We might all sign that, and Tyson might say, like, we're already doing something, right? Versus actually kind of giving materially to a worker center that can immediately help people now. And like Larissa said, getting to know the workers you're supporting, right? Having them lead you. What do they want you to do? What do they need you to do? And essentially kind of put our money where, you know, where our mouth is for those of us that have those resources. Right? Obviously, this is a pandemic. Not everybody has $5 or $10 or $20 to spare. But I think if you have that, if you have those resources and you're actually interested in helping people, direct relief is the best way to do that.
It's really interesting.
I would like to say, if you don't have money to give, I would encourage you, and even if you do, I would encourage you to talk to your state government and make sure that they have a task force to address the very critical and unique issues that agricultural workers are facing. Right now across the country, there's a lack of transparency about the number of cases for meat processing plants and farms. And so, you know, again, our community deserves access to information. If I am a worker, if I have the information, I'm going to make the best decisions to take care of my family and my health. But if those numbers are not released, how can I do that? And how can the institutions that are supposed to protect me, how can they do a good job when nobody knows the reality of what's happening? I think that people should also be asking that workers in this industry are tested often for free, that they're getting paid when they have to leave work because of being quarantined, that people receive financial assistance if they lose their jobs. And, you know, just in general, that people can have good working conditions. Because as Mireya said before, you know, it's not that this is bad work, it's that the conditions are not great. And so what do we want? We want shade breaks for farm workers, drinking breaks. We want hand washing stations. We need potable water. We need bathroom breaks for people that need processing plants. Some people have to wear diapers to go to work. We want for 12-year-olds to not have to go to the fields because their parents make little money and they have to work to help them and expose themselves to pesticides. So, you know, even if you can't contribute financially, there's so much you can do just by joining joining their voice and asking the government to improve the conditions.
I think these are all great directions to take this discussion in, because I do think there's modes of direct action, there's awareness, there's a conversation that needs to be had in food studies where we collectively say, food studies has to contend with immigration reform. Our food system is broken unless we reform immigration. And by that, I mean, you know, workers who work in the US should be able to have families in the US, should have every luxury that an American has. And by luxury, I don't mean items. I mean being able to see their families or to send children to school, or even just, you know, to have decent housing. I think all of those things are real issues. And at least in our work in the food system, you know, there has to be a shift from basically understanding our plate and the culinary appeals of our plate to actually understanding the politics of labor of our plate and understanding how we can change that. Because there's no sense that these workers who feed us are hungry. And Larissa, I mean, the kind of work that you're doing, again, in direct action and making sure that families are fed are really part of the, you know, the exposure of the fissures that were already there, the inequalities that were already there and existed, that these farm workers feed people and don't have food.
Yeah, the first food distribution we did, we had over 300 cars. The line was over 2 miles long. And so, you know, I wish that we had a drone to take a picture of, you know, just to show people the need, you know. And I just think that if you care about the environment, you should talk about agricultural workers who are exposed to pesticides. If you care about women's issues, you should talk about reproductive rights and how some farm worker women can't get pregnant because they were exposed to pesticides, or how they maybe have kids with birth defects or they can't feed them. If you care about children, you should care about kids who are working in the fields and getting exposed to chemicals and doing really bad at home because they can't keep a really hard job and also go to school. You know, any type of issue, of course, including food systems, has to do with immigrant life. And so it's definitely an invitation for people to explore that and incorporate it into the causes that they care about.
And I will do my shameless plug, at least from what I saw at, you know, the ministry. You know, one of the things that I was touched by is the idea that, you know, you don't, you know, have this narrative of, you know, these are poor workers that can't do anything for themselves. And instead you actually hire workers to become organizers, to address these needs, to address issues brought on by hurricanes, to address issues brought on by trauma, and, you know, and really to begin to see themselves as, again, those agents of change, because this kind of change has multiple scales. One is on the definite national scale and state level scale, where we need to say workers' rights need to be pushed further on this agenda because they're important, and that workers' rights are also tied to immigration justice. But then on the local level, we do have to have these conversations about how do you empower communities to actually address the problems that they see and empower them in ways that aren't paternalistic and don't take away from this agency that they know they have. And I was blown away by the fact that, the ministry does hire their local workers to do the job of organizing. So,
well, thank you. That's very kind.
So
I think that, the ultimate goal is that we don't have to exist, right? That everybody can have dignity, that they don't need to go get food.
I think you are one of the few organizers that I've met that has said, my ultimate goal is for my position to not exist, because we've reached the sense that things are more equitable. I've cut and pasted the link to the Piscopo Farmworkers Ministry donation. If anybody would like to donate, it's there. This record will be archived in this conversation so that if you want to share it or talk about it, I invite you to have these really difficult conversations with your family members and friends, and to think about those people. When you pull out an apple from your fridge, when you pull out that tomato, to think long and hard about the dignity that these workers deserve and how we are complicit when we don't take action. I'd like to thank my favorite people, Perla, Guerrero, and Larissa. And I'd like to invite you to say one last, basically, takeaway that you'd want to share with people, so that we can say bye to everyone.
I would just say that I think, we're living in a moment of crisis. And I think maybe we feel overwhelmed, maybe today, yesterday, tomorrow, right? Because there are so many things happening that are heavy and difficult. And I just hope that we can really see one another for who we are, for our humanity, for our dignity, and to really stand with one another, right? And to listen to people when they're telling you about their experiences, and to reflect on that, right? And see what you can do. Like Larissa said, if you don't have money, to be in touch with your state and state representatives. Also, federal policy needs to change. Organize, kind of self-organize into being that change, right? That you want to see, and always centering workers' voices. So I hope that this contributes a little bit towards that.
Well, I would like to close by thanking everybody for listening to us today, and also, like I said, encouraging you to develop relationships with people who are different than you, with vulnerable populations. Sometimes that means more than anything else. It's just knowing that somebody cares about you, that somebody takes the time to talk to you. And so once you do that, you're going to see that everything else will be a natural process, Solidarity works both ways, and I'm excited that you're taking the step to learn more about food systems and workers. And if you have any questions, you can always email me, larissa@efwm.org. Thank you.
You might have a whole lot of emails sitting in your mailbox tomorrow morning.
That's okay.
And, and I think it's important, if you want to know more about Perla Guerrero's work, her book is fantastic. I teach parts of it. I teach all of it. It's called Nuevo South. It's a fantastic introduction to all of the issues that we're talking about, and deep dives into new areas that really need further exploration. So this has been a wonderful chat, and I hope that folks had a great time, and I'm really sorry about all of the questions that I could not get to. We thought that we'd cap it around 6:30, and I hope everyone has a really good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like we're on a TV show.